I read Shadows of Self by Brandon Sanderson for the Summer of Cosmere project, where I am reading all of the Cosmere stories in order, the publishing order that they originally came out in. So you will get spoilers for everything that came before this, like Warbreaker, The Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, the other Mistborn stories, and a little pile of short stories as well. And this story picks up about 1 year after the Alloy of Law, which first introduced us to Wax and Wayne and this new era of Mistborn that's kind of set in a pseudo 1800s American frontier style setting with all of the Mistborn powers and culture shoved in there as well. So we got pulp heroes in the form of like Lone Ranger, Batman style lawman and his trusty sidekick, Wax and Wayne. And because the story is a detective story, we start things off with a murder, as is traditional. And so we get in the perspective of a corrupt politician who is literally holding an auction to find the highest bidder for his political favors, and has all of these corrupt people all in one place, and someone assassinates him as well as a bunch of criminals all at once. And this leads to uncovering a deep layer of corruption that exists within the city of Ellendale, kind of the capital of human civilization in this era, which inherited the government that Ellen Venture set up in his constitution. That's, like a elected republic model style democracy. And the people who have been in charge for the last 300 years have descended from the kind of noble class of people who, the allomancers of the previous age. And they've enjoyed incredible wealth and privilege, but it seems like they are becoming more and more corrupt and less interested in actually improving the lives of the regular working people in the city. And this is leading to like a sharp divide between the working class and the ownership class in Ellendale. There's growing resentment on both sides. And I've talked extensively in other podcasts before this about the way that people are drawing their identities from difference, a sense that we are not those people over there. And in the first book, we really saw that distinction drawn between the city people and the people who live in the roughs, the area, outside of the city that has a kind of wilderness and desert land. It's less fertile, harder to live out there, but there's fewer people and fewer laws. In this book, the emphasis is really on the difference between the working class and the ownership class. And just like in Alloy of Law, I think you see a, liminal kind of character, or a character who doesn't care about this boundary of identity in Wayne, who is able to cross from one side of this economic divide to the other very easily, because he has retained all of his kind of low class criminal culture ways from the roughs. But at the same time, he has become incredibly wealthy because of the reward for solving the mystery in the Alloy of Law, where he was awarded like a portion of all of the aluminum, which is incredibly valuable in the Mistborn world. And he lives in the mansion, with Wax. And so basically he is a rich person, and he's able to move around in that rich culture pretty well because he's such a good mimic that he can just pretend to be one of them by copying the way that they behave. And he does the same thing with the poor people. And there's a part early in the book where he borrows the hat of a homeless man, and he gets him to talk so that he can get his accent just right. They're trying to track down a possible suspect in the poorer part of Ellendale. And Wax and Marcy are interrogating the people who live in the area, and they won't talk to the police because that's like ratting out your neighbor. That's just a good way to like get in trouble with everybody that you have to deal with every day. And maybe one day, if you do that, then somebody is going to tell on you and point the finger at you. And so, you don't want to cause that kind of trouble for yourself. And so they're basically stonewalling Wax and Marcy. They're not getting anywhere. So Wayne goes in the other direction and gets to know some of the locals, especially this homeless man, and trades him for his hat. And Wayne's whole thing about hats is so delightful. How, it's a magical little thing that, allows you to adopt the persona of somebody else by covering up your brain. It's the magic key that lets him turn into another person. But I think the real thing that he's doing here is we're so close in his point of view that we start to see the thoughts change in his mind when he takes on these personas, and he starts to think the kind of thoughts that the person that he's imitating would think. And so there's a deep kind of empathy that Wayne demonstrates when he is acting out these personas that reminds me a lot of Shai from The Emperor's Soul that we read previously. So in that short story, Shai has to create the soul of an emperor who died, but they were able to bring back his body, but not any of his personality. And so she has to create a personality for him from scratch. The way that she's able to do that is by thinking in this radical empathy kind of way of like, what would I be like if I was the emperor? How did he see the world? And then she encodes that into him with her magic. That's the exact kind of thing that Wayne is doing as well. And his ability to do this is really the key to solving the problem in the city, but except that none of the leaders in the city have this skill that Wayne does. This is the real problem in the city, is that nobody knows how to think across these lines of identity. They're trapped in seeing the world through this lens of perpetrator and victim, where, the poorer class see themselves as victims of the upper class who are, corrupt. They don't care about taking care of them the way that they're supposed to, and they're not living in the spirit of the Constitution. And those corrupt officials see themselves as being the victims, where the perpetrators are the working class people who just want everything from them and have no respect for rank or propriety. Like, what's wrong with these people? And so seeing yourself as the victim in this case causes this bright line of identity that makes it almost impossible to cross over from one side to the other. And that entrenchment is what is going to allow the antagonist of the story, Bleeder, to continue to ratchet up the tension throughout the book and get it to the point where at the end it's, almost boiling over and you're going to have riots in the streets and maybe even a revolution. But I think it's really significant that right up top at the beginning of the story, we get those moments with Wayne, as funny and entertaining as they are, as great as Wayne's perspective is to see because it's, so whimsical and weird. It's also doing thematic storytelling work of giving us a contrast to the way that Wax and Marcy are trying to deal with regular people in their own neighborhood. They're not approaching them in an empathetic way. They're not having respect for their space and their perspective. Instead, they're insisting on their own authority over these people in their own space. This also touches back on the thing that I was talking about before with Hobbes and social contract theory, the idea that as people, we have the right to commit violence against anybody around us at any time, but we give up that intrinsic freedom or right to do that to the leaders and rulers, the kings of the world, and invest them with our capacity for violence so that we can trust in a peace from our fellow citizens around us. And the contract being that, we will do what the ruler says, the king says, as long as they are protecting that peace that we experience where violence is not perpetrated against us. As long as the king protects us, then we honor the king's power, basically. And what you see in the city, and the reason that the regular people are getting so upset, is that the social contract is being broken. The ruling class is not holding up their end of the bargain. There's more and more expected from the working class people with less and less protections, and there's no sacrifice on the part of the ruling class people. Instead, they just get to have more and more corruption, more and more privilege. And it's like all the rules apply to the working class people and none of the rules apply to the rulers. And so it's remarked on over and over in the book that, by different characters, that the common people are right to be mad. They are right to start a revolution. They have every right to try and assassinate the governor because this corruption is happening and it's a breach of the social contract. And this is the final way to kind of like seal that breach, is to destroy the king who is not upholding their part of the bargain so that you can install a new king who will do the job. At least that's, the model that Hobbes creates anyway. And I think that the story is intentionally referencing that kind of political theory and like leveraging the justice, the logic of justice that is inscribed in it. But there's more to identity in the story than just these, roles of victim and perpetrator, than these economic stratum that are shown to us early in the book, or even, the difference between the lawmen and the citizens, or the lawmen and the criminals. I think an important element to identity that we see in Wayne, early in the book there, is an enjoyment of himself. He really likes being who he is, where he pretends to be different people in the pursuit of doing his detective duties. He's going about it in a really unconventional way, but that's part of the joy of the experience for him. And so that's a core part of his identity, is the enjoyment of that whole thing. And we see that when we're in the perspective of Marcy as well. Early in the story, she thinks to herself about, the way that her life, until she has gotten to this point in her career, has been really humdrum and has been filled with people telling her who she is and what she should do, especially her mother, trying to convince her to marry well, to find the right kind of career that will make her father feel as if, he should have married her mother instead of, putting her away. He cheated on his wife with Marcy's mother, and Marcy's mother has always felt like she could have been a highborn lady, she could have fulfilled that role of being married to Marcy's father, but she was never given the chance to do it. And so she wants to mold Marcy into the kind of woman who could have been in that role, to show her father that he was wrong. But that's not the life that Marcy has been interested in. Ever since she was a little girl, she's been interested in law enforcement and the legends of the roughs and adventure. She's basically kind of a fan of these pulp Lone Ranger, Batman style, Zorro style stories. Probably, just like us, the reader, actually. And I think there's an element to which, Marcy is a fangirl in the way that we, the reader, are also fans, and it helps us to connect with her. I've always felt close to Marcy when I'm reading the book because of this. I'm a fan of Wax and Wayne in the same way that she is a fan of Wax and Wayne. And then as we both get to know them together, we see Wax and Wayne differently, but we start to care about them differently as well. So they become less pulp heroes. Like the romance of the whole thing kind of fades away, but something more rich and concrete kind of settles in place of that. All of that to say that, there is this kind of romanticism that, this naive way of thinking about law enforcement when she's a little girl, that she wants to pursue it. But now that she's here and she's been hired into the constables and she's working with the highest ranked kind of chief of police type of rank in Ellendale, she feels incredibly happy and at home. And this is, I think, the virtuous version of personal identity. It's related to what I was just talking about with Wayne, where he feels that joy as he is, changing from persona to persona. Marcy feels the same way as she's walking through the police office and she's, giving statistics to the chief of police and explaining to him, the intricacies of all the latest laws that protect the rights of criminals and what they can and cannot do. And, the significance of all of her statistics and all of this stuff. She just feels very joyful and happy that she's in that place, even though it's not the thing that anybody in her life wanted for her. And that's even in the face of people trying to tell her who she is. And so, at one point early in the story, there's a guy who calls her a bastard and then is like, hey, I don't mean that in any kind of mean way. It's just a fact of who that is who you are. That is just a fact of your life, and you shouldn't be upset about it. And so her society tries to define her according to her parentage, according to her father, and they try to totalize her personality based on that. And everybody does treat her like a bastard insofar as, as if she finds out that people see her as someone who skipped rank, almost like a nepotism situation, because the chief of police has a different leadership philosophy than the kind of cronyism that has been happening for decades now in the police department. And so the way that things used to work up until this point is that you put in your time and the most senior person, no matter how competent or useful they are, gets that cushy job next to the chief of police that Marcy has right now. And the chief of police sees the role that Marcy is in as a unique position to mentor a newer constable that has tremendous potential so that they will be able to maximize that potential in their career. And it's not, cutting in line all the way to the front kind of a situation, but instead, a kind of fostering of a future leader that cultivates a more stable future that has to do with earning your position instead of just being the one who lasted the longest. But all of the people around Marcy don't really understand that. They're not seeing it through that lens of leadership that the chief of police has. Instead, they're applying that label of bastard to her and meaning it in that kind of double sense, that she's someone who has betrayed the system, that there's almost like the same kind of corruption there is how they feel, that the working class people feel about the rulers. And at the same time, in that part of the book, we get Wax talking to somebody about, he's talking to his grandmother in this scene, and she's telling him, you are Terrace, you are a part of our people, and we are a people who are this and that and this. And Wax responds to her that a person is what they do. Like, your actions are what define you. That is how Wax understands identity. This is really important because if we think back to what I was saying in the Alloy of Law about Wax, his identity is that he was a lawman in the roughs, and then he shot the woman he loves, and that turned him into a criminal. And he's been running from that criminality in him ever since. He's been trying to remake himself into a house lord, into, a newly engaged man, into a competent businessman, and now into a consultant with the constabulary, a kind of consulting detective role. But like anything that he can do to get away from the criminal who shot the person that he loves the most in the face, right? Because Wax has this very dualistic thinking that is dominating the city right now, that, you're either a victim or a perpetrator. He turned into a perpetrator the moment that he shot Lessie in the face, right? Even though it was an accident and he didn't intend to do it, the way that Wax sees the world is you are what you do. And what did he do? He shot Lessie. And so he is a perpetrator. He is a criminal. He's someone who should be locked up or hanged. And he doesn't know how to rectify that kind of identity crisis. And I think for him, he that's why he dives into the work so hard. He's trying really hard to do something else, and that will let him be something else. But the truth is that action is always haunting him. It is always, right over his shoulder. There's always something reminding him of it again and again. And this is where I think the title of the book, Shadows of Self, comes from. That, he's always got that shadow of his past there, this way that he sees himself. And he's unable to forgive himself for this accident. And even though in the Alloy of Law, kind of symbolically, he hunts down, his shadow self in Miles' 100 Lives, the lawman who turned into a criminal deliberately and, kind of went into this decadence of enjoyment of, wholesale murder and committing crimes. Wax rejects that. He hunts him down and destroys him, as if to destroy that element of his own personality. But it's not enough. We see that he's still wrestling with this way that he sees the world. And he's still trapped in this double bind of identity where he is trying really, really hard to be a lawman, but deep down he feels that he is a criminal. In the book, for Wax's story, and it really is Wax's story, I would say, is the unraveling of that crime, at least that's the way that Wax sees it, of killing Lessie. Because it turns out that Bleeder is Lessie, and that Lessie was always a Khandra who was put in place to manipulate Wax's identity into becoming the kind of person that Harmony could instrumentalize in his grander plan for the fate of humanity on this world. And so that's a really crazy thing that I said. And I just jumped way ahead in the story because I was just talking about the very beginning. But it's very directly connected. And I hope you could see that, how the antagonist in the story is Lessie. And the reason that it has to be Lessie is because it forces Wax to confront this way that he sees himself. And he has to, by the end of the story, he doesn't accidentally kill Lessie. He very intentionally murders her, right? And on one hand, it is to stop the mayhem that she's doing, but there's also something almost merciful about the way that she dies. It feels like she's been tortured, or that her existence itself has been too difficult for her to bear, because as a conjurer, she's been alive for more than 1,000 years. She's from like the second or third generation. She's a very old conjurer, and she worked directly for the Lord Ruler. She was, his personal conjurer many times. And when Harmony took over, she became his dedicated conjurer as well, which is why she goes out and, to the roughs and protects Wax. But it seems like there was a genuine affection that she grew to have for him. And the romance between them was not a kind of contrived, cynical trick to manipulate Wax, but was a genuine response and like the real chemistry between those two people. And it brought into a sharp contrast for Pa'an, which is her name, her conjure name. She's called Bleeder throughout the book until the very end, where you find all of this out. But I think falling in love with Wax creates this sharp contrast for her, where she sees herself, maybe for the first time in centuries, that she has her own desires and wants that have nothing to do with the master of her contract. And that Harmony is telling her, you have to do this, you have to give up Wax. You have to get Wax to the point where he's going to leave the roughs. I need him back in Ellendale. And so you have to find a way to make that happen. And she doesn't want to have it happen, because now she cares more about Wax's happiness, about his freedom, than she does about Harmony's plan. And she knows that her dying would be that huge motivation that Wax needs to leave the roughs. It's probably the only way that he would leave the roughs, because now, all the pain of that loss is associated with that place, and Wax is going to run away. He's going to run back to what he knows. As painful as the city was for Wax, it's going to be less painful than that place that he lost Lessie. And she knows that. And so she knows that by dying, by allowing herself to be kind of quote unquote murdered, that it will create the effect that Harmony wants. But she doesn't want that, because it's going to hurt Wax so much. However, and here is one of the big themes in this book, Pa'an doesn't have a choice really at the end of the day, because the way that the Khandra are constituted, they have those two spikes in them with hemalurgy, and that gives Harmony a kind of direct control over the Khandra. And so he gives her the instructions, do this, do that. And if she refuses to do those instructions, Harmony has the power, because of the hemalurgy, she's kind of compromised. So he has the power to reach into her and manipulate her like a puppet and make those things happen. And that kind of ability really gets into that same theme of it dramatizes it on an almost cosmic scale of corruption and identity, right? Like, here is a leader who can victimize his followers whenever he chooses by overwriting their identity with his intentions. How much more corrupt does it get than that? Like, in the Hobbesian kind of social contract sense, Harmony is crossing a line that completely goes against what the king is supposed to do for the people, right? He's not protecting Pa'an. He's not protecting Wax here, he's victimizing them to be instruments in his plan. Now, maybe that plan, in a broader sense, like has a grander vision that's going to protect more people. But if that kind of thinking sounds familiar, it's because we've seen it all the way back in Elantris with Wraithen, that kind of trolley problem thinking. And it's been repeated again and again by the bad characters in the Cosmere, all the way up to Taravangian in the Stormlight Archive, right? The guy who, underneath of his free hospital for everybody, has loads of terminally ill people and homeless people who are being intentionally bled out so that when they die, they might, say a little word of prophecy that gives Taravangian a slight edge in his weird little religion that he's got going on. Everything in Taravangian's Nostradamus-esque religion is calibrated to work within the confines of that trolley problem thinking. That it's okay to sacrifice some people, it's okay to victimize some people if at the end of the day, you're saving many, many more people, right? And so it's not clear why Harmony needs to traumatize and hurt Wax in order to achieve some other greater end. But what's interesting is that we actually get to hear from Harmony in this book in a really direct way. Now, he did show up at the end of Alloy of Law, and I don't think that I talked about it very much. It's interesting structurally what goes on at the end of Alloy of Law there, that there's literally a kind of deus ex machina that happens, right? Where like Wax runs out of ammunition. He forgets where his guns are, like he loses his guns and stuff. And he prays to Harmony to help him. And then Harmony like literally speaks to him and miraculously provides him with more weapons to continue to kill people. So that's like a pretty wild thing that happens in that book. If you're thinking about, like a God who loves peace and hates violence, which, is what Harmony attests to in this book. But when Wax sits down and meditates and puts in his special earring that was delivered to him, Harmony is able to directly communicate with him, just like Ruin was able to communicate with Vin in the original Mistborn trilogy. And actually, via the same, an earring in her ear was the vehicle that was used to do that. I've always kind of wondered if maybe it was the same earring actually that he has, but there's no way of knowing that. I don't know if that's true. But the point is that he talks to Harmony, and Harmony gives us some insight on, his point of view in this whole thing. And what Wax demands from Harmony is more direct action. He wants Harmony to intercede more in the lives of people, that he sees Harmony's inaction as a kind of cruelty to, in the face of suffering, Harmony does nothing. And Harmony's response is that in actuality, things have been too easy for humanity, and that because of that ease, they haven't had to push themselves in order to succeed and progress. That, in other words, they're kind of like staying static, which is interesting because that was the Lord Ruler's entire goal of his government, was to arrest the development of society and keep it in a steady state, which aligned with the values of the god preservation. Preservation doesn't want change. Preservation wants like a continuity of sameness over, the longest period of time possible. But Harmony, is really pushing for a kind of progress in this idea that difficulty and suffering are the motivators for a kind of progress or improvement over time, resonates with the short story that we just read, The Sixth of Dusk, right? Where Dusk talks about that whole thing, that if somebody gives you the gift of a spaceship, that you should be very suspicious of that gift because you haven't earned that level of technology. You haven't done the work to get to that point and progress there. And that, it's a kind of the work itself, or the journey before the destination, to take it back to the Knights Radiant, is more important than, that end goal of having lots of advanced technology. And that even goes back to Shadows for Silence in the Forest of Hell, where you think about, Silence thinking about the life that she has given to her daughter that was better than the life that she grew up with, with her grandmother abusing her. Well, she didn't abuse her daughter, but guess what? That meant that in not giving her that difficult life, it didn't equip her to fight against the ghosts in the forest. And that caused her daughter to be permanently maimed and crippled. And so there's a way in which, by raising her in an easier lifestyle without that trauma, she actually literally crippled her. And I think that's how Harmony sees the society of Ellendale, that the corruption and the rot in the society is a direct effect of the ease of life in the valley. And so when Wax asks, for things to be even easier than they are, for them to get more help when people are in trouble, Harmony's response makes a lot of sense, when you look at it from that angle. And while I think that there's, a logic to that whole thing, and maybe even a truth in it, it does remind me of a colonialist kind of theory of racial superiority that was, put forward by Europeans when they were going around the rest of the world and encountering indigenous people that they considered to be savages. And this idea said that, we come from this rugged, mountainous European continent, and we've traveled over the ocean, and we've gone through all of these difficulties, these trials and tribulations, the Black Plague, what have you. And all of that has forged us into a superior people who have created the best technology on the planet. And therefore, that is why we are more advanced and more civilized than you, the savage, and why we have every right to absorb your society into our kingdom. And so the idea there being that the suffering causes a kind of virtuous development that entitles the person who goes through the suffering to greater rewards, because it has spurred them into greater advancement. That there's like some kind of like societal meritocracy at play. And Harmony seems to think that the more he intercedes in the lives of people and directly helps and has, miraculous intervention, the more he's going to hinder and hold back the society from attaining this kind of advancement in this colonial ideology. But at this point in the story, Harmony lays out for Wax the problem that's going on, that Bleeder is a Khandra who, and all of the Khandra kind of operate almost like angels do for God. Like they seem to be the messengers of Harmony. They directly communicate with Harmony and they carry out his will in the world. And just like the European idea of angels, the Khandra intermix with society and like live among the regular people, that you can't tell the difference between a regular human and a Khandra most of the time. And they're just out there in society living amongst the humans. And while they're out there, they are serving the agenda of Harmony. And we know that they definitely are doing that because even if they don't want to, Harmony is able to take them over and, kind of puppet them. And he explains that to Wax, that he has this ability to do this, but that Pa'an somehow has removed one of her spikes And the other spike is not of Harmony somehow, and it is hiding her from Harmony. And so he doesn't understand how this is possible, which shows the limitations that Harmony has, in terms of a conception of God. And oftentimes, this kind of bothers me in the Cosmere, that it's brought up over and over again, that especially you see this in the Stormlight Archive with Dalinar, that, they talk about the Almighty, and then the Almighty, at the end of Way of Kings, tells Dalinar, I am dead, and that I have been killed by another god who is just as powerful as me. And then Dalinar goes on to feel that if the Almighty was killed, then he was never actually God, because God should be, all powerful, all knowing. This kind of conception of God that comes out of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, right? Like the Abrahamic tradition of a monotheistic God who has, an omni capability. It's just weird to me that this is somehow ascribed to deity automatically. This is part of the reason why Light Song doesn't believe in his own religion of his own deity, right? Like he understands that he has limitations, and therefore he's doubtful that he could be a god. How can he be a god if he can't remember his own past? How can he be a god if he doesn't know the right thing to do? And, he always wants to behave in a selfish way. So how could he be a god? But, if you go to study the actual religions of the world, 99.9% of all the religions that have ever existed in human history involve limited gods who have all kinds of human frailties and imperfections, right? And that this idea of, the omni god is much more rare in religious societies throughout history. And so why the characters would automatically just assume that, why would Wax just assume that Harmony should know everything and should be able to perceive everything, especially given, the way that Harmony writes about himself in the scriptures, that he was once just a person and that he ascended to godhood, but that, he still doesn't know everything yet. And I'm not saying that because this bothers me that this is some kind of problem in the story, but I think that the reason that we see this over and over again, even though it interrupts my immersion in the story because I just happen to know a lot about, like religious studies and stuff. I'm a nerd for religions. And so I'm like, why would somebody just assume that God has these attributes? I think the reason that people assume that in the Cosmere is because there's some kind of deeper innate knowledge that many people share about the nature of deity in the Cosmere. That there's something deeper that is inscribed in maybe the spirit, like the spirit realm version of the person kind of knows that there should be some kind of all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present God, but that there is an absence of that God maybe, and that when they encounter deity and they find it to have these limitations, they have an intrinsic natural reaction, if you will, to the wrongness of that kind of deity, in the same way that like nobody has to teach you about eating something, like when you're a baby that's like giving a baby like an unripe strawberry or something, they'll bite into it and they'll just spit it right out. Nobody has to tell them that that is not ripe enough to eat. You're just built in with that kind of knowledge. I think it's the same kind of thing that Sanderson is building into his characters, that they have this intrinsic sense for the divine and how, if there is a God, how that God should be. And when they encounter these finite gods, they feel a sense of disgust and rejection towards them. But that's a little bit of a rabbit trail that I just went down. It's just something I've thought about bringing it up before this, but I think it will become more significant the further along the Cosmere goes. But it has been built in there since the very beginning, honestly. It's even there in Elantris to a degree in the musings of Wraithen. But the point being that Harmony is limited not only in holding himself back from giving divine aid to the people in the world, but that he has hard limitations in his capacity, in this case, to track Bleeder or control her at all. And so he has a real need for Wayne in the story, for Wayne, I guess for Wayne, for Wax in the story, as an agent who can do things in the world that he literally cannot do. So Wax can do things that God cannot do is like a crazy thing about this story, but it's true. And at the beginning of the story, the very beginning, I didn't talk about the prologue, but it's kind of funny because Wax presents himself like it's the story of how Wax and Lessie meet for the first time, which is a kind of hilarious caper where Wax is in way over his head because he doesn't understand how to be a lawman. And him and Lessie have this immediate bond. It's very cute. It's a sweet little story. It's a very cool, pulpy, comedic little adventure that happens. But one of the things that Wax says, or the way that he presents himself to the criminals, is, I'm Waxillian Landrian, the lawman for hire, right? Which is like, he's like, I'm the hi-ho, I'm the Lone Ranger, right? Like he's trying to make like a saying for himself so that he can have a reputation and be known. But what happens here in this part of the story? God hires Wax. So he is the lawman for hire, but it's God who's hiring him. And so that identity that he tries to claim for himself in the prologue is actually affirmed by God himself. So that's kind of interesting. But the thing that Harmony tells Wax basically is that Bleeder had this purpose, had this identity that was chosen for her by God, and that she abandoned it. She left the service of God in exactly the same way that Miles Hundred Lives left the service of the law, in exactly the same way that Wax himself is afraid of leaving the service of law, of leaving the path of God. The thing that Bleeder has done is the thing that Wax is afraid of in himself. And the fact that it turns out to be Lessie is all the more significant. That Sanderson is wrapping several aspects of, core to the trauma of Wax together. He's kind of braiding them together into the character of Bleeder. So she represents that part of Wax that he rejects, this potential for criminality, this crossing of lines that he's done. She has betrayed her purpose and her identity that was set out for her. She's breaking the laws of God. And in doing that, she crosses over into the criminal behavior, right? She's out there and she's murdering people. She's out there and she's causing mayhem. She's escalating chaos in Ellendale. She's trying to break the government. And this is the thing that I think Wax is afraid of in himself, that he killed Lessie. He crossed this line from being a protector into being a perpetrator. And what else is he going to be capable of after this? Where will it end? This kind of nightmare behavior that Bleeder is doing is the thing that Wax is afraid he has the potential to do inside of him. And when he goes out and hunts her, the dogged, hate-filled way that he so violently treats everyone around him is that kind of bound up, lawless violence that's being channeled towards his target. But I think that is the potential for violence that could be spilling out in every direction in his mind, that he believes that if he didn't have that target, if the law wasn't there to constrain him, that's just how he would be to everyone. That's the thing that Wax is really afraid of. And so Bleeder occupies this space in the story that illustrates a way that Wax could be. And the thing that unlocked that possibility for him was Lessie herself, that in losing her, it made him into the kind of man who was capable of, if he could kill the person that he loved the most in the world, what could he not do? What could he not perpetrate going forward? That's the ultimate boundary already. And a lot of the rest of the story, it comes down to the detective story of figuring out who she is, where she's at, what is she doing, why is she doing it, which is all like a really well-constructed detective story and is a lot of fun to follow. But I see certain parallels with the second book in the original Mistborn trilogy, The Well of Ascension, where, remember in that book that there was a murder early on of someone, and there was bones found in Vin's bedroom, which meant that there was a new Khandra somewhere in the castle. And Vin spent a lot of that book trying to figure out which one of her friends was actually secretly one of her enemies. And we spend a lot of energy in this book trading passwords and with Wax trying to figure out who is really a Khandra and who isn't, and coming up with, different methods. There's like a scientific serum that's introduced into the plot that can reveal who a Khandra is, and figuring out all these rules that might uncover the identity of a Khandra against their will. But I think Sanderson is deliberately kind of echoing the second book in the original trilogy with his second book in this new era of Mistborn as well. There's a familiarity there structurally, but it twists it a little bit because in that second book, that was underlining the way that Vin was regressing back to those maladaptive behaviors of hypervigilance and not trusting her friends. It was being dramatized as like, oh, one of them is a traitorous Khandra. They look like your friend, but actually they are your enemy. And that was just the thing that she believed about people anyway, as a way to emotionally protect herself. In this case, it's not about, for Wax, who can I trust and who can I not trust? It's about making sure that he's hunting the right person. He's trying to find that appropriate target, because what he's afraid of is accidentally attacking the wrong person, right? Because that is what he did in the past with Lessie. So in both cases, there's like a broader structure there, right? That is similar between the two books, where both of the characters are kind of worried about this situation that actually exists in their past, and it's holding them back from discovering the real truth about the situation that they're in. In the case of Vin, the Conjurer was there with her all along and was probably her closest friend in the book. And in the case of Wax, the truth is that the person that he loved the most in the world was never really the person that he thought she was. And that gets into this idea of fate and manipulation that is so core to Bleeder's story, I think. She resents Harmony and his control and his plan because it required her, after she had experienced love and come back into contact with her own, true identity, instead of playing a part, she actually really did fall in love with Wax. And Harmony required her to end contact with him, even though, it caused suffering for both of them. And Harmony makes this claim that the suffering is for the greater good and will cause a kind of advancement in the people who suffer. But what is the effect of that suffering actually when we examine it in the story? The real effect of the suffering in Bleeder's case is to rebel against harmony, and it causes enormous chaos, damage, and suffering in society. And what is the thing that Bleeder does once she has freedom from harmony? She reaches into those corrupt corners of Ellendale culture and like overturns them in a way that makes them visible to the working class people. The working class people are crying out to their leaders and probably to Harmony himself for justice and equity in their society. And the answer that they get in return is silence. It is inaction. And so those regular working class people suffer enormously, and it builds up this pressure that's going to lead to an explosion of violence in the city. That's the effect of the suffering that Harmony is talking about, the advancement of society. It's going to lead to riots in the street and violent revolution and burning the buildings down. And Harmony's calling that the good thing. And so when Bleeder goes into the society, what is she uncovering? She's uncovering all of the bad things that society has been, covering up and have been incubating there, that Harmony has been allowing to fester. And while it might seem like she is trying to incite the riots and the revolution and all of that stuff in the city, I think there's a way in which her unconscious desire is to reconnect with Wax, that by causing all of this, criminal disturbance and all of this chaos, it will attract Wax back to her, and that she can reveal to him the truth about, their shared past, but also the role of Harmony in the suffering of the people of the world, including Wax's own suffering himself, that his suffering was artificially induced. He didn't have to go through this extreme trauma of killing the person with his own hand that he loved the most in the world, just so he could be placed back in a position to take over the household from his corrupt uncle. Surely there could have been some other way, right? Where a Khandra could have come to him and explained to him, like, I'm a Khandra, I'm a messenger from God. Your uncle's a real jerk, and here's all the problems that he's causing, and it would be really great. God wants you to go back to the city and clean up the city, please. Maybe that would have worked, Maybe that was another avenue that could have been explored instead of shooting your wife in the face. And so I think what Bleeder is doing, maybe unconsciously, this is maybe a little bit of a reach on my part, but I don't think too much of a reach, because she knows Wax so well, is that going out here and causing these problems and imitating the governor is going to pull him into the situation in such a way that ultimately he's going to successfully diffuse the tension in the city. That Wax, she has that faith in him. She believes in Wax in a way that I think even Harmony doesn't. Harmony just uses him. He hires him like a killer for hire, the way that he was in the Roughs. He's go out and kill my enemy. Bring her back dead or alive, right? Like he's a bounty hunter. But I think Bleeder believes in Wax in a way that even Harmony does not, that he is going to find the solution to A, the corruption, and B, the inequality in the city, and see the riots that are growing out of that tension. And ultimately, that is what happens. And it's down to the help of his allies in Marasi and Wayne, and this chief of police who has come up, not through the nobility, but through the common ranks. And again, that comes back to that theme of, he doesn't come from the cushy nobility. He comes from the suffering common people, and therefore he is somehow equipped to be a better leader overall because, he's gone through it. I think there's something in the story that ratifies that position in the way that the chief of police, steps into the governor role by the end of the story. It ratifies that he would be a better leader, and we think that partially because he has suffered more than the people who have had that position for a long time, right? But I don't think that's down to Harmony's plan. Like, all of this didn't turn out, I think, the way that Harmony was looking for it to turn out necessarily. It seems to me like Harmony was fine with a violent revolution popping off in Ellendale or some kind of civil war situation, which would maybe ruin the valley and cause the humanity to have to leave that area and struggle to survive out in the roughs in order to have a catalyst for societal and technological advancement. But at the end of the story, that's not what happens. And once Wax knows the truth, this utterly breaks his connection with Harmony, and he can no longer follow this god who doesn't share the same values as him. In a way, he reveals God to have this criminality encoded into him, right? He is riding over the will of his followers in a way, and simultaneously ignoring his responsibility to help the helpless and to intercede in the tremendous suffering of his followers. And all of that, I think, Wax finds to be unacceptable, kind of criminal behavior on the part of God. And so there's a resonance there too with Dalinar from the Stormlight Archive, right? Where he becomes God's accuser, that like, you're not good enough. You should be better as God. You were not a good God. That is the same kind of feeling that Wax has. But I think the journey is more personal and profound for Wax than just merely kind of uncovering the truth about this whole situation. Because symbolically, what's going on here is that Wax is forced to confront these two core elements that sit at the heart of his trauma, right? So on the one hand is this sense of being a perpetrator or a criminal, having this potential for chaotic violence that, if unchanneled, would be incredibly destructive to everyone around him. And that is encoded into the person of Bleeder throughout the story. And then on the other hand, this issue of his feelings for Lessie and the guilt around it. And this kind of ambiguity about, did he kill Lessie or was it an accident? Does Wax really deserve to think of himself as this perpetrator of violence on the person that he loves? Or is he taking on too heavy of a burden and, kind of indulging in a type of self-pity that is a selfish way for him to hold on to his grief longer in order to stay emotionally in contact with Lessie? Is it just a defense mechanism against the loss of her in his life? And that question is resolved in the plot by him literally shooting her again. And the way that he shoots her, he shoots her with a hemalurgic spike. And that delivers her back into the control of Harmony. Since she has two spikes in her, she becomes available to Harmony's domination and manipulation. In other words, he delivers her back into the corrupt influence of her leader who has broken the social contract with her, right? And this is significant for a larger kind of allegory that I think is operating in the story as well. But to keep it personal to Wax here and his own trauma and what I think is going on, Wax unambiguously shoots Lessie and unambiguously causes her to die and feels good about her dying. Like he sees the way in which she kind of twists her own biology in the way that the Khandra figured out how to do after Ruin's attack in the end of the previous Mistborn trilogy. They were like, we ought to have a contingency plan where we figure out, how we can die if we need to. And she uses that technique to kill herself. And Wax has a good feeling about it, that she somehow deserves to get out of this no-win situation where she has like this fate or this inscribed job that God is forcing her to do against her will. And as she's dying, that is the moment that he learns, her true identity and what was actually going on with her and the real, relationship that he had with Lessie. Like the full context of everything is revealed to Wax. And in that moment, he fully does cross over into that killer. He's been so worried about appropriately channeling his violence towards the criminal and not towards the innocent, because he feels that, he channeled that violence towards the innocent lover in his past and destroyed her. And now he must never, ever do that again. But here he has done it again. And it turns out that she was never innocent, that she was always a deceiver, but maybe that the love was actually true. And so she existed as two people simultaneously, that she was both the true lover and the criminal at the same time. And this presents Wax with an irreconcilable problem, that he sees the world in this black and white. You are either the perpetrator or the victim. Lessie is both. She is the perpetrator and the victim. He has killed her again, but she is the one who perpetrated the deception on him. She is the one who perpetrated the trauma on him of her dying in the first place and manipulating him to get back into the city. Again, we come back in the Mistborn story to this idea of paradox and the way that paradox allows us to transcend our fate or our identity, that we can reforge ourselves, we can remake ourselves, because as people, we exist as paradoxes. We cannot be held down by these simple dualistic propositions. And so once Wax comes in contact with that paradox, it explodes his identity and this framework that he has built his entire way of life around since he left the Roughs years ago. And in the wake of that, he is just left with grief and with a denial of God. He doesn't know how to be himself anymore at the end of the story, because he's fully come in contact with the fact that, he was both the victim and the perpetrator. He doesn't know how to be this contradiction. He doesn't know how to exist as a paradox. It sits outside of his worldview. And we leave him in that uncomfortable place at the end of the story. Now, the other thing that's happening on the societal level, I think, is that we're having this, big republic, democratic society that Ellen Venture envisioned in his constitution, this kind of utopian dream that he talked about with his friends, over late night drinks, based on all of his, philosophical discussions and readings and stuff like that. And it reminds me of Plato's Republic, where in Plato's Republic, they talk, the Republic is a utopia of a kind. They didn't have that word for it, but they're trying to come up with the most just society or figure out what justice is. And one of the avenues that they try to get there with is by creating the ideal society. And one of the suggestions for how to achieve that is by having this society where you come up with this religion or ideology that is not true, but you're going to tell the people that it is true, that in their souls, people are born with different metal affinities built into them. Does this sound familiar? Different metal affinities being built into people in their souls? Maybe it sounds a little bit familiar, right? And the idea is that some people are gold on the inside, other people are silver, and other people are bronze. And that this justifies the stratification of society into different levels of leadership and labor. But there's a way in which the entire thing is a cynical system of control that is upheld by the religion in the society. Like they teach all the people that, the gods made us in this way and that we can identify who is gold and who is silver and who is bronze. And that the leaders at the very top will know that the whole story is not really true. But for the most part, most of the people will be born and live and die believing that this, justifies their entire way of life, while it is actually controlling their opportunities in the society. And all of this is for the greater good of, creating a balanced society that is the most rational and just version of a human city that you could possibly have. And whether that's true or not, or, is left up for debate in the philosophical text. But the point being that there's an idea here that lying to the public at large for their own good is justified and actually produces a greater justice and peace for society. And if you examine what happens in the story with Marasi, this is what takes place. And it's what Harmony is doing with the Khandra at large as well. So the Khandra are kind of like sprinkled into human society all over the place here. And it seems like for the most part, they just kind of live their lives and they do whatever they want to do. And then every once in a while, Harmony will tap them and say, like, go over here and talk to this person and do this specific thing. And then you can go back to living your life. And that is the way that they kind of intercede in the lives of people, to facilitate Harmony's plan. But now what Harmony's plan is that, like the governor of the city has been killed by Pa'an and she took over his persona. She's impersonating the governor. And they spend the whole book like trying to protect this guy when he's actually been dead for the whole time, ironically. And then once they discover that, Milan takes his bones and, impersonates him in front of the crowd and gives a speech that tries to like diffuse the rioters. But then that's when the chief of police comes up and arrests the governor for corruption. And then they imprison Milan and she hangs herself, in parody. She's not actually dead, but she hangs herself so that the public at large believes that the corrupt governor killed himself, which is a kind of de facto admission of guilt. Which all of that to say is a huge deception of the people. Like they don't tell the people at all, oh, actually the governor was assassinated and then was impersonated by one of the faceless immortals, by one of the Khandra. And that Khandra was, a rogue agent who was influenced by some other outer god that we don't understand, and on and on. Like, there's a truth that exists that could be communicated to the people, and then they could make their own judgment of that truth based on the facts. But that's not what's done. Instead, Marasi chooses to and participates in lying to the public at large in order to manipulate them for their own good. And I think that this more closely aligns Marasi with Harmony than Wax is aligned with Marasi, and is part of the reason why Harmony tells Wax early in the story when he's, telling him the whole thing, basically hiring him to do the job. He tells him, like, you should appreciate Marasi more. I've invested a lot of time and effort into her, and she's one of my special people. Like, she is doing to, like, the solution to this whole problem is to lie to the people. They've been lied to for this whole time by the corrupt politicians. The politicians are like, elect me and I will work in your best interest. And then they get elected. And what do? They don't work in the best interest of the people. They work for their self-interest. And then they turn around and they lie to the common people's face. And they say, no, that's not what's happening. I'm not corrupt. There's just all these criminals. But don't worry. We're going to clean up the streets. We're going to get you better labor laws. We're going to protect you. And what do? The exact opposite. They just lie to the common people. What is Marasi's solution to this situation? It is to lie to the people. She becomes complicit with the exact thing that she's trying to clean up. It's a different kind of corruption. It feels, in the story, I think, emotionally more justified. It feels like the right decision in the moment, to diffuse this violent riot feels like a good thing, but it participates in a larger bad thing. And I think it's directly related to the way that Wax shoots Pa'an with the spike. So when she is compromised in that way, back into Harmony's influence, Wax is delivering Pa'an back into that enslavement, back into that control, the same way that Marasi is deceiving the people and delivering them back into the hands of these officials who lie to them. These two stories are like braided together in parallel in a way that I think they're speaking to each other in a very particular way. Even though we leave this story feeling like, the antagonist was stopped, the riot was diffused, the ending is pretty much happy. I mean, it's not great, but it's the second book, so it's like the dark middle chapter, so that's okay. But for the most part, everything is pretty good. When you really look at the structure closely, I think what it shows you is that the characters compromised in some essential way. Like, there's a certain kind of internal failure to live up to the standards that these characters would like to hold themselves to at the end of the story. And there's a suffering that happens to them because of that. But I think that makes the novel really crunchy and interesting. And again, aligns it with that second book, The Well of Ascension, where at the end of that book, Vin tried so hard to do the right thing along the way, and she gives up the power at the Well of Ascension, and it turns out that was a huge mistake, and that when you want to change the world, what you have to do is grab onto that power and not be afraid of it. You have to seize it. And it feels like there's a resonance with this story as well, where the characters, were fighting against corruption at the beginning of the story, but at the end have become complicit with the corruption and failed to stand against it, and instead have joined in with it in a way that they've compromised in some sense, and they've lost something about themselves. And so both of those books incorporate a kind of failure and anticlimax that gives there's a resonance between them that delivers a greater complexity to the overall Mistborn story and a different flavor of failure. So this isn't about a deferral of power, because in this case, the characters, all of these characters already have formal authority in their system. So this isn't a failure of them to step into powerful roles. Instead, it's a failure to live up to the standards that they are holding themselves to while they occupy those positions of authority. And so it evolves that lesson that Vin learned in the second book, that these characters have appropriately stepped into a place of power. They've learned that lesson from Vin. They took the power because they want to change the world and to do good things. But once they had the power, they fell into a state of compromise and complicity that has compromised their integrity. And so that they're going to have to learn from that lesson going forward and work out, who they want to be going forward. And so on a totally different note, I just wanted to, at the end, also point out, because there was no really good place that came up in all of that thematic exploration there, that we have these interstitial parts like we have had through so many of the Cosmere books, where, like in the original Mistborn trilogy, we get those excerpts from the logbook or from the scriptures that Sazed is writing that kind of give us exposition in the form of, a little quote at the beginning of each of the chapters. In this book, we get a peek at the broadsheets for the city, the kind of newspapers, and we get to see all of the familiar kind of capitalist yellow journalism that happens in the late 1800s in America. And so you have in American history, you have these really rich men, these huge capitalists like George Hearst, for example, who buy these newspapers and then use them as propaganda tools to manipulate the American public into aligning with their financial and political interests. And also just saying sensational, untrue things that will help to sell more newspapers, like drumming up anxiety and panic, stoking feelings of resentment, racism, whatever will sell the newspapers. But it's not like just the humdrum, here are the facts, here's the naked information, make of it what you will kind of journalism. It's, like I said, it's yellow journalism. It's very like politically charged, and also like attacked particular individuals who were the personal and political enemies of the owners of the papers. And you see that in the broadsheets, the little excerpts that we get, where at one point they're like Alamancer Jack personally attacks the character of Wax and says, like, don't ever associate me with that man. He's a terrible person. I hate him. And there's various news stories about what a menace Wax is in the city and how he should be prosecuted for his, jumping around using his allomancy and crushing people's cars or bending light poles or messing up fences and things like that. And then you see like the stories that are in the broadsheets, the actual fictional stories like Alamancer Jack, and how they have kind of commercials braided into them and saying like, oh, I bought this suit at blah, blah, blah tailor on this street. Look for a good deal there, and this kind of stuff, which totally did exist in those pulp serials that I was talking about. That's how they kind of paid for them. But it's just very funny that instead of getting, these ancient logbooks about, the hero of 1,000 faces in the past, the hero of ages who existed yon in another age, we're getting this look at this bustling capitalist society that is full of free speech on the one hand, but corrupted speech. That seems to be the price of freedom. That's what one of the themes that Harmony is introducing here, right? That I give you your freedom, but it creates the freedom for you to act in a bad way. It creates the freedom for you to be indolent and to not advance in the ways that you should. And so part of the cost and part of the responsibility of freedom, I think, that is implicit in these interludes with the broadsheets is that truth is something that individuals have to be vigilant about when they are encountering the broadsheets. They have to be discerning about the bias that is inscribed in the information that they're encountering in the broadsheets, and to use their discretion and judgment. And it's not clear to me that people are doing that. And I don't think that the broadsheets want them to do that. They want them to be loyal customers. They want them to be outraged and freaked out and angry in the ways that they're trying to make them angry. And all of that is related to the way that Harmony is reaching into the Khandra and manipulating them. It's related to the way that Harmony manipulated the life of Wax by having him fall in love with Lessie and then having him kill Lessie and having him come back to the city and inherit this house, right? The way that Harmony feels entitled to move Wax in the world is directly related to the way that the broadsheets are trying to manipulate the public at large. And that's related to the ideas that Marcy herself had in the previous book, right? She's talking about this broken windows theory of societal manipulation, where if we can create the right kind of environment, it promotes the right kind of behavior. That we have a responsibility as the leaders of the society to create an environment that manipulates people at large into the best behavior. That's the ideology that Marcy explicitly subscribes to. It is aligned with this kind of cynical, funny yellow journalism that when you read it, you're like, oh, that's hilarious that they're doing this in this thing. But that is right in line with everything else that this novel is exploring about society. This is just another avenue of manipulation. It's a much more obvious one. It's a humorous one, but it is directly related to these other themes, the same theme that's being re-expressed in more dramatic ways throughout the book and throughout the series, honestly, because this was in Alloy of Law as well. And it was in the Allomancer Jack short story that we read as well. So for the next book, we're going to stay right here. We're just going to advance slightly into the future. And we're going to move to the Bands of Mourning, which is the next part of this era 2 of Mistborn.